Surprisingly, let's say that in our bingo card, hoping for any balance tuning to come before the release of the season, the balance tuning being focused on healers wasn't exactly high on our priority list. But apparently that's what Blizzard has in mind for the release of the next season, because this is what we have for balance tuning as announced by Blizzard, a whole bunch of changes to healers. And when I say changes, I actually mean nerfs. Now, before we go and harshly judge Blizzard about this, let's go over and talk about what exactly was changed, starting with the biggest of the nerfs, which is to Mistweaver Monk. So, Mistweaver has all of its healing reduced by 13%. Now, let's have an illustration, a visualization of why exactly has Mistweaver been nerfed. These are the top logs on Ferak, for example, and this is the result. Now, even if you were to look at, for example, some of the, or I guess the only surviving healers not called Mistweaver being able to make it in here, you will see that that's because pretty much the Mistweaver Monk was half AFK and healing far lower than he normally should, even down to having some ridiculous results, like for example having a 2% log being on par with a 30% log of a Druid, or having a 29% log being on par with an 80% log of a Holy Priest. That's how powerful Mistweaver Monk was. It was so powerful, actually, that being nerfed by 13% is actually nowhere near enough. Because by looking at, some of the good logs of these players, you will see that Mistweaver is gapping healers by far more than the 13% nerf they are receiving. This is a 100,000 HPS gap. This is like 35% more healing by the Mistweaver. This is a 110,000 HPS gap. This is a 100,000 HPS gap. So we're talking in the 30-ish% range of more healing, not just 13%. The only one that somewhat kept up with Mistweaver and was only in the 10% gap in range in high results was Discipline Priest. The other ones were far lower down and didn't really have a close time trying to keep up with Mistweaver. What's the fact also about Mistweaver itself is that their general rotation is not really tied to cooldowns. They're not really healing like a Discipline Priest, for example, or even Resto Druid with its ramp style based on Tree of Life and Flourish. This is actually just continuous, like happening at all times, constantly. It is just tied to spreading Renewing Mist and then targeting one player with Soothing Mist and spamming Vivify to splash the healing around thanks to their tier set, which can happen basically at all times. They're not really super dependent on things like Yulon's Grace, things like Invoke Yulon, or God forbid, even something like Revival or Restoral as a cooldown. That's the other part of the power of the Mistweaver healing, which receives now a 13% nerf. Down the line, we have the second biggest nerf, which is to Discipline Priest. This is a bit more complex because Discipline has multiple calculations to be done when it comes to healing. The atonement transfer rate is now 35% instead of 40% when it comes to turning the damage of your abilities into the healing version. And then the increased healing that you get from atonement is no longer 50%, but it's now 70%. Now, if that sounds confusing, here's the visualization of what actually changes. Previously, if you used your smite or whatever and did 1000 damage, 40% of it was turned into a heal, so you would be healing for 400. Except, Atonement buffed all of the healing you did with your damage by 50%. So that 400 heal would actually be turned into a 600 heal. The changes now are that 1000 damage is converted at only 35% the rate instead of 40%. So now the heal is down to 350 instead of 400. But the Atonement convert in Mythic Plus is now increased to 70% instead of 50%. So the 350 heal goes up to 595. Now, from 600 to 595, it's a very small change. It's about a 1% nerf when it comes to your healing in Mythic Plus. However, the Atonement heal increase is only outside of raids, which means the 70% only counts for Mythic Plus. If we go back to the raid, it is still at 50%. So the 350 base heal gets increased by only 50%, so it becomes 525 in the raid. So previously you healed for 600 in the raid, now it's down to 525, which is the TLDR of about an 8 to 9% raid healing nerf to Discipline Priest. So as we mentioned before, Mistweaver Monk gapping everyone by a massive amount except for Discipline, only being gapped by a respectable amount. Well, never mind, now Discipline Priest is also being nerfed alongside Mistweaver Monk. At the very least, that's not gonna impact them too much when it comes to Mythic Plus. Not that it should matter, as we have talked about before. If Shadow Priest continues to be meta in Season 4, there's not gonna be really any space for Discipline to be healing in Mythic Plus, but yes, if we had to go by the current results in the raid, if there were two healers to be toned down a bit in terms of healing, they were Mistweaver and Discipline Priest. So, what about the rest then? If those are the two that needed to be nerfed, why do we have two more nerfs coming out? Because the other nerf is to Restoration Druid, and the other one is to Restoration Shaman. Both of these specs are being nerfed by 5% in healing. Now, if we go and give them the same treatment as we gave the other two healers, that seems a bit weird, because both Resto Shaman and Resto Druid are not going nearly as well as Mistweaver and also Discipline. The case is even more mysterious when it comes to Resto Druid. Why? Because with the upcoming season, Restoration Druid isn't actually changing their tier set. So they are remaining with what they already have. So if what they already have makes them the third, tied third healer in the raid with like Preservation and maybe even Resto Shaman, then why would they be nerfed for the next season? This perhaps might have more to do with Mythic Plus, where their healing is actually very strong compared to the raid. That perhaps might be an angle. It definitely, though, doesn't feel like they required a nerf when it comes to the raid in terms of their throughput. The discussion, though, is different for Resto Shaman, because some of you might be confused right now. You're like, hold on a second. In Mythic Plus, Resto Shaman is not really one of the more popular picks. They are averaging 200 to 300 rating less than the top 3 Mythic Plus healers, which have stayed the top 3 Mythic Plus healer for the entire season pretty much. And when it comes to the raid, they are in a similar, meh situation in terms of throughput than the other basically bottom healers. They are far below Mistweaver, still below Discipline, and also still nowadays also slightly below Preservation Evoker and Resto Druid. Now, what changes for them compared to Resto Druid is that they are actually going to be changing their tier set. This is something we have mentioned when we were talking about the changes coming to Season 4, and the tier set of Resto Shaman being a key point in the change for the power of the spec, because it's a powerful tier set. Even though we mentioned the boredom of the tier set because it does absolutely nothing new and it's completely passive and runs completely in the background, it has the power of boosting your secondary stats. One of the more powerful things you can get towards the tail end of an expansion are buffs to your secondary stats, because you start the expansion at 380 item level and 10% crit, and you will finish the expansion at 525 item level and 50% crit. So now suddenly a tier set like this, which gives you a flat out 10% more crit, which bypasses all of the diminishing returns of your gear. As you try to stack more and more secondaries, you gain less and less because of the diminishing returns. This tier set completely bypasses it, and on top of that, it makes you heal for even more based on your crit. So this is a very powerful tier set later on in an expansion because of the scaling of your secondary, in this case crit, which is something Resto Shamans go for already, also thanks to their resurgence, making them even more stable in terms of spending mana. So it's a very powerful tier set later on in an expansion. So it has a much better synergy with what you get this season compared to your current tier set. Also, your current tier set is awful in Mythic Plus, since, spreading around Riptide to 10 targets is kind of useless when your party only has 5 players. Not that this Season 1 tier set is that strong for Mythic Plus. It has no damage, it has no powering cooldowns, no extra defensiveness or anything, but at least for the raid and for your scaling with crit is still very good. That might be the angle that Blizzard saw with the release of Season 4. They were like, hold on a second, Resto Shaman is going to actually scale super well with this tier set. We predict it's going to be a little bit overboard with the power, so we are preemptively nerfing them by 5% before the season is even out. That is the logic they have put on this nerf to Resto Shaman, which otherwise, of course, would make no sense. If Resto Shaman would have kept their current tier set into Season 4, like Restoration Druid does, then this nerf would have much less sense. So at the end of the count, of course, question marks as to why Preservation Evoker and Holy Priest and Holy Paladin are all missing. Perhaps the biggest loser out of the three definitely has to be Holy Paladin. Now, Holy Paladin is effectively going to spend half of the expansion with practically non-functioning, broken spenders. You have an entire spec around building Holy Power and then spending it, and your spenders are terrible. That's definitely a loss in this expansion for Holy Paladin. Preservation Evoker admittedly isn't that bad. The new tier set they are getting is going to help them go back to their Echo-based build, which is much more preferred by Preservation Evoker compared to the current Blossom build. Their performance should actually improve as well in this season. And Holy Priest, I guess they have been buffed 3 times already in this season. Maybe Blizzard thought this was going to be enough coming into the Season 4, but we will have to see the beginning of the season. Now back to what we said at the start. Harshly judging Blizzard, because as we were hoping and wishing for some balance tuning, perhaps what we were more interested in were, for example, retouches to something like Vengeance Demon Hunter, perhaps even something like Fire Mage or Red Paladin to come in this season. We weren't exactly having healers in mind when thinking about the balancing of the season. So yes, let's just say that something is missing from these changes, and let's also just say that we are not completely out of stock of Hopium. There is still a full week left before the release of the season, so there is still a hope left that Blizzard will finish this balance tuning of today with actually more impactful balance tuning for the season. They started, let's just all agree to believe they started releasing the least impactful of the balance tuning changes, and then, you know, in a couple of days, 2 to 3 days, they will go into the middling type of changes, and then a couple of days before the release of the season, they will hit us with the big ones. That's what we have decided to believe for today. So, with this recap of today's balance tuning, which is pretty much just nerfs, we are now leaving each other on this Wednesday. Thanks, of course, as usual, to all of the Patreon supporters for the contribution and help, which, as usual, can also be given completely for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these pointless things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, I have 1, 2, 3, 3. Okay, so 63 left for about 14 hours. I think it will last. Of what, you ask? Who knows?